Welcome everyone, Costin here with a discussion about Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. Or rather, I'd say that this video is particularly relevant to Immortal Empires, though I am using campaign footage from the Old World mod, which is currently in a beta. Very early stages, so once it fully comes out, would recommend it then. Right now, they've got a lot of work with it, but it certainly does create a much better experience in a lot of ways. Now, the issue I want to talk about is an issue that has plagued Total War really since the very beginning of the series, but in particular Warhammer 3, because of the way settlements are so very close together, it does affect Warhammer 3 in a way that it didn't affect quite a few of the older games. Like Warhammer 2 didn't have quite the same issue, at least not in the same way. And that is, of course, the issue of auto-resolve. Now, here's my perspective on how an auto-resolve system should work in theory. One, it should push you as a player towards fighting the meaningful battles, the field battles, against the legendary lords in particular with their full stacks, but it should also allow you to skip a bunch of the pointless, grindy, easy battles. So a settlement garrison is not going to stand up to a legendary lord. Like, look at Grombrindle's army. He has 10 units in his army right here. There is no chance that these minor garrison forces, even if they had the settlement layout that Creative Assembly has removed from these minor settlements, but even if it was a minor settlement battle, there is zero chance that garrison is going to be able to win. And even when it comes to inflicting casualties, there is zero chance that those garrisons would be able to inflict any kind of serious casualties on Grombrindle. And that will happen if I fight these battles manually. But let me just resolve these first two battles over here. So over here, we got an army of Blue Horrors of Tzeentch, Screamers of Tzeentch, Chaos Furies, and a Prince of Apostles. If we resolve this particular battle, here is the result. We lose 95 units, particularly the miners, but we also suffer some Quarreler damage. And we kill 553 units. And then, if we go over here on the settlement and auto-resolve that, we lose 46. Again, 720. So fewer casualties, but I do want to point out that if you were to fight these battles manually, the casualties would be significantly lower. Now, some people will argue that, an auto-resolve is not going to represent how a battle actually is fought. It's a simulator. In fact, that's exactly how Creative Assembly does it. It simulates battle conditions. It's not a one-to-one to how an actual battle is fought. The problem is, the system is kind of broken in a lot of ways. The reason it's broken is because you end up taking significantly more damage, in particular certain units, than you actually should. In fact, this is actually a good result. The one that I just got is actually a really, really good result. There are many other results that aren't so great that do end up working far worse. So, one of the problems with auto-resolve is not the field battles. The field battle auto-resolve is fine for the most part, though there is a glaring issue with that as well. But the issue is all these garrisons. As I stated, there is no chance that the garrison force over here would be able to put up any kind of real fight. When you look at the damage Grombrindle took, you look at the damage the Runesmith took, you look at the damage these units end up taking, it is a bit of damage, isn't it? If I were to fight these battles manually, I would have maybe lost, 10, 20 men total in both of them. And that is one of the problems, that you end up taking significantly more damage in auto-resolve battles than you do in manual battles. A second issue is that any garrison that you do encounter in the game will present such a formidable challenge in terms of auto-resolve that you end up in situations, and this applies to you as the player, but you end up in situations when you're attacking a garrison settlement with a very basic garrison, and they end up inflicting severe damage. Now, another issue that's very relevant to this, and this applies to field balance as well, is that armor is a ridiculous modifier when it comes to the auto-resolve result. So the auto-resolve, the way it works, it's going to calculate damage, and it's going to do damage. Never mind that in an actual battle, one side may take very, very little damage. Like, if you're losing a battle, this applies to you losing a battle if you're fighting manually. If you're fighting a battle manually, and you lose it, chances are you may suffer significantly more casualties than enemy. But in auto-resolve, you end up in the situation where one side, the game is trying to balance it out, I suppose you could say, where both sides will take some level of damage. Now, this doesn't just hurt the player, believe it or not. This also hurts the AI, because there's many ways to cheese the auto-resolve, in particular if you're attacked in a settlement, to inflict staggering losses on the enemy. Another issue related to the armor is that it benefits certain races far more than others, like Warriors of Chaos. Why do Warriors of Chaos dominate the campaign map? Well, one of the big reasons Warriors of Chaos dominate the campaign map is because their auto-resolve is so ridiculously powerful, because they end up having a lot of melee units with high levels of armor. On top of that, and so do the dwarves. The problem for the dwarves is that they have poor casualty replenishment, so they end up suffering from that perspective. They don't end up benefiting as much from their high level of armor, but they will generally take fewer casualties than auto-resolve. But Skaven, like a race like a Skaven, like if you're playing a Skaven campaign, you might win every battle that you fight on the campaign map, but you're probably going to end up having to fight every battle on the campaign map if you want a good result. So you end up with a lot of those grindy battles. But furthermore, the armor imbalance that gets created with auto-resolve does affect the AI in a significant fashion, because it affects which factions and which races become dominant on the campaign map and which ones don't. It is a major issue, and I don't think armor should play that much of a role. Another problem is that the auto-resolve is not taking into consideration certain abilities, like magic is not properly accounted for as well, like, Runesmith, for instance, you can get a Rune of Wrath and Ruin. And magic is not accounted for, army abilities are not accounted for. Most importantly, Ikeclaw, who has nuclear weapons, his power is not accounted for by the auto-resolve, which from my perspective is a major issue, because that's one of the main powers that Ikeclaw does have, and one of the main reasons he is so dangerous to deal with in a campaign is precisely because he does have those nuclear weapons. But if I'm fighting against Ikeclaw, I pretty much want to auto-resolve every single battle against them, because I don't want to deal with the nukes, and I can avoid dealing with the nukes. But if you're playing as Ikeclaw, your full power will never be reflected in that auto-resolve. And it applies to other Legendary Lords as well. So, take into consideration, if I can find her, take into consideration Draika. So Draika is an absolute nightmare to deal with in any kind of manual battle. The reason Draika is such a nightmare to deal with is precise because she does have a lot of powerful magic and effects that really crush your morale, make it difficult to cast, and makes her army incredibly powerful. Like, it really debuffs your army, which makes her army more powerful. And she already has one of the strongest armies in the entire game. So it becomes a nightmare to end up having to deal with Draika on the campaign, in any campaign in a manual battle. But here's the thing. You cannot resolve your way to victory. And that's one of the problems. There's a severe imbalance that gets created in the game because of the way the auto-resolve system works. Because here's the problem. It's not just a player versus AI interactions. It's AI versus AI interactions. It's how some factions become stronger and how some factions become weaker. Like, when was the last time you saw Draika end up dominating the campaign map? Or any Wood Elf faction, for that matter. Because if you find Wood Elves in a manual battle, yeah, you realize how bloody dangerous they are. But in reality, they end up being insignificant on the campaign map because the auto-resolve is not really reflecting their actual power, which is the big issue, really. Beyond the annoyance and the grind that you do get, that you do have as a player, where it's pretty much always best to fight the Garrison battles in particular. It's kind of a weird situation. Like, let's say you encounter another Legendary Lord with a full stack, and you cannot resolve it. Well, it might be just much better to take the auto-resolve damage, because you might actually end up taking more damage if you were to fight ally during Lord in a proper field battle. But when you encounter a settlement, a minor settlement, it is generally better to manually fight the battles. And that's one of the biggest issues with it. And then yes, the AI imbalance, which benefits certain races, certain factions far more than others, and is not accurately reflecting the power that these factions do have in battle, and the power that and the potential that these factions, these races, should actually have, which is a major issue. Things like armor, things like leadership. Well, leadership makes sense, but armor being so highly valued when there's plenty of effects that can, help out with that. Like, consider Skaven. Skaven may not have the highest level of armor on a lot of their units, but things like Night Runners, God Runners, other units may have a significant amount of physical resistance, so they actually won't take a lot of damage. Or you consider an army like, say, Oxyatl. Like, Oxyatl's army, if you actually have to face it manually, is a nightmare to deal with. And if you're playing as Oxyatl, you'll end up annihilating every foe that stands in your path. But the problem is, his army, because it's not a high armor army, will actually end up taking significantly more damage in any kind of unresolved, which actually severely limits his campaign potential. Like, consider Oxyatl in Mortal Empires. He's fighting Kairos Fateweaver for the south, and he may end up losing. Very rarely do I see Oxyatl just completely annihilate Kairos. But if you actually find manual battles, Oxyatl versus Kairos, Kairos can win because of his powerful magic, but Oxyatl's army will absolutely walk over anything that Kairos might be able to put forward on the field. Well, minus Forsaken and Sangors, but still, a significant portion of Tzeentch army cannot stand up against skinks that Oxyatl does have and will recruit. And there's another example of an imbalance. Furthermore, and this goes really to the point, furthermore, the way the damage calculations do happen. Let's say you have a balanced army between melee and range. Now, in this case, surprisingly, my Quarrelers actually ended up taking a decent amount of damage. But more often than not, what I've seen again and again and again in Warhammer 3, in both Realms of Chaos, Immortal Empires, and yes, even Old World, one of the things that does happen is when you, like, if you're playing a faction like the Dwarves, or the Empire, or Kislev, you may get a couple of melee units to hold your flanks, to form a kind of front line, but a lot of your army will be ranged, because that's where the power lies, that's where the damage potential is. Like, if you're playing a Dwarf campaign, sure, you might recruit some Miners and Dwarf Warriors early on when you don't have a Tier 2 barracks, but once you get to a Tier 2 settlement, what you're going to be doing as the Dwarves is recruiting pretty much exclusively Quarrelers, with a couple of Dwarf Warriors to hold the flanks in particular. Now, in a manual battle, these units will take very, very little damage because you would deal the vast majority of the damage before the enemy even got in range. And since they're flank protection units, you wouldn't be charging, and you'd just be trying to hold the line where needed, where you exploit vulnerabilities elsewhere. The issue is, because of the auto-resolve, these kind of melee units, like Dwarf Warriors, Dwarf Miners, or just any kind of melee units in a balanced army, like Spearmen with Shields for the Empire, etc., end up taking significantly more damage than any kind of range units. Like, you might have an enormous number of battles in a campaign that you auto-resolve where, like, your melee gets reduced to like 50% HP and your range is untouched. Now, this further creates a significant imbalance because it benefits some races versus others. One of the reasons Warriors of Chaos does so well on the campaign map is not just because they have high armor units, though that's obviously a huge benefit, and their casualty replenishment isn't too bad, but another thing is Warriors of Chaos is pretty much a pure melee army, so it really ends up hurting these kind of balanced armies and pushes people. So instead of using a wide variety of units, you end up in a situation where you realize as the player that actually army variety is kind of pointless because it will just force you to fight a bunch of meaningless battles that are just a cakewalk instead of just like being able to auto-resolve things. Now, sometimes it doesn't work, but there are just some units that take a significant amount of damage. Like, let's say you have a couple of melee units. If you were to fight those battles manually, they would take very little damage. But again, if you auto-resolve, they'll take a significant amount of damage. Oxyatlh, for instance, in Immortal Empire starts with 2 dinosaurs in his army, and if you auto-resolve the initial battle against the Bloodthirster, they'll be pretty much dead. even though in the actual battle they would take very, very little damage, considering the way Axel's army works. Another issue with respect to dodge resolve, and this is where I get really annoyed with creative assembly. So you have the settlement situation, and the reason that any kind of garrison is doing a lot of damage to any army is precisely because what creative assembly did with Warhammer 3, as opposed to Warhammer 2, is in Warhammer 3, obviously they added those minor settlement battles. Now, to take into account for those towers, blockades, and all that, and the settlement itself, they made it so every kind of garrison, any kind of settlement, does a significant amount of damage to any attacker. That, by the way, does not match reality in any way, shape, or form. Like, I've talked about the siege situation in many, many videos, and one of the things that I've made clear is sieges are some of the easiest battles to fight manually. Some of the worst battles to fight manually, but some of the easiest battles to fight manually if you've built a proper army to deal with them. So it is really annoying that what they did was they added this element where dodge resolve for both yourself and the AI is stacked in the defender's favor when a minor settlement is attacked. And even a major settlement, like as I said, like sieges are a joke. Like sieges are a joke for any attacker if played properly. But any kind of settlement garrison will just be able to inflict severe damage. And hell, one of the reasons, and hell, like looking at my garrison here, garrisons here, they're very, very weak for whatever reason, like the initial one. Regardless of that. So that's another problem. That wasn't the case in Warhammer 2. Where in Warhammer 2, if you showed up against just a settlement garrison, you could just watch resolve that, unless it was a walled settlement. But given the way sieges worked in Warhammer 2, the wall actually protected the defender, so it's like sieges could be difficult in Warhammer 2, shockingly enough, where it's their joke in Warhammer 3, which is one of the major problems that does occur. And the final issue with dodge resolve is related to difficulties. This is on legendary very hard difficulty. That's the difficulty I play pretty much all my campaigns on. Here's the problem with difficulty settings. The way dodge resolve works is that if you set the battle difficulty higher, even though it may not change anything at all in terms of the results, casualties in the manual battle, what very hard difficulty will do is it will make it so that in every battle that you fight and you auto-resolve, you'll end up taking significantly more damage. Now, that's a major issue, especially now that we have the AI stats modifier. Like before, you could have said, oh, it's the extra stats the AI gets. No, the stats don't matter. It's just the battle difficulty. Well, I'm going to say it, the better tactics the AI uses on very hard mean nothing. In fact, there's quite a few people that have stated, and I think they're right, that playing on lower difficulty actually makes the AI more competent. But here's the problem, and why I would strongly recommend, if you're playing any kind of serious campaign, do not play on anything lower than very hard. Because here's the issue. You might think, oh, I can just play on Ledger and give the AI a bunch of bonuses, and, you know, it will be fine, and kind of just lower the battle difficulty. Okay, here's the problem with that. If you lower the battle difficulty, yes, you will get a better auto-resolve result. In fact, you know, when I'm just having fun or I'm testing stuff, you know, you might be tempted to just play a campaign on easy, but battle difficulty, because you know you're going to win the vast majority of battles. But here's the problem with that. If you modify this battle difficulty, even like within the turn, let's say I set it to easy, I auto-resolve whichever battle I don't want to deal with, I take minimal casualty. Sounds great, right? No, because this breaks the AI. On the campaign side of things, you might wonder how, but okay, so if you leave the battle difficulty to very hard, the AI will, more so than on a lower battle difficulty, actually use its campaign resources better. So it's going to be more aggressive, it's going to expand better, it's not going to sit on its ass doing absolutely nothing. So one of the things I would recommend people, like even if you're playing, by the way, even if you're playing the game on normal, like let's say you're playing campaign on hard or normal, I would strongly recommend you set this battle difficulty to high. Yes, it will make the auto-resolve an annoyance to deal with, but it's overall going to make the campaign better, because the AI with higher battle difficulty, because it does have that better auto-resolve result, or it has an auto-resolve modifier, the AI will end up being far more aggressive on the campaign map than it would on a lower battle difficulty. So if you set this to easy, even though I am on legendary, if I set this to easy, I will end up getting a very passive AI on the campaign map. Now, this will last for, let's say, a couple of turns, and then the AI fixes itself. Let's say, I set this to easy for this turn, and then I set it back to very hard. All that, it is going to take a couple of turns for the AI to fix itself and reach the level of aggression that it should have on very hard. That is something that I think Creative Assembly should change. Like, divorce the auto-resolve from battle difficulty. Battle difficulty should not affect auto-resolve. If anything, the one thing that should affect auto-resolve is the AI stat modifier. And I emphasize that the AI behavior should not be changed by sliding something that affects your auto-resolve. Now, I understand why it does. It probably is something to how the AI is built. Like, the AI is going to look at a situation and decide based on what it believes its auto-resolve chances are. But if you play on a lower difficulty, you end up having a significantly worse campaign AI just purely because of that lower battle difficulty, which is a significant problem. People have talked about how the AI is very passive on the campaign map. Well, that's the reason, because I imagine the vast majority of people play on like normal battle difficulty or something along those lines, or hard, but that's the point. Like, if you're playing on those lower difficulties, the AI on the campaign map is actually less competent, or it's using its armies less well. Campaign difficulty seems to affect like resources and pretty much that. Behavior changes are determined by the battle difficulty, which is a major problem from my perspective. I think maybe AI behavior should only be affected by campaign difficulty. That's my perspective. Kosin here signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications. And if you enjoy my content, consider supporting me via PayPal or Patreon.